There's a building in Washington, D.C. that tells a story most people have never really questioned. It rises with confidence, granite walls, towering arches, and a clock tower that stretches over 300 feet into the sky. Completed in 1899, the old post office pavilion stands as a symbol of ambition, craftsmanship, and, more importantly, funding. Because here's the detail that should make you pause. This structure was built at a time when the United States government did not collect income tax from its citizens. Not a single dollar. And yet, this wasn't an isolated project. Far from it. Before 1913, the federal government financed massive undertakings, projects that even today would require billions of dollars. We're talking about the expansion of a national military, the construction of federal buildings across dozens of states, support for major international conflicts, the development of transportation infrastructure that connected an entire continent. All of this without taxing personal income. So naturally, a question emerges. How exactly did the government pay for all of this?
Real quick, if you love discovering stories most people have forgotten, subscribe, turn on the bell so you don't miss what's coming next, and leave a comment. I read them all.
Official explanation. Simple but incomplete. If you open most history textbooks, the answer appears straightforward. Before 1913, the federal government relied primarily on three major sources of revenue: tariffs, taxes on imported goods; excise taxes, levies on products like alcohol and tobacco; and land sales, revenue from selling public land. On paper, it sounds reasonable, even efficient. In fact, by the late 19th century, tariffs alone accounted for more than half of federal income. Add in excise taxes, and you get a system that appears to function without needing to reach directly into citizens' paychecks. But when you begin to compare the numbers to the scale of government spending, things start to feel less certain. A closer look at the numbers. Let's step into the year 1890. Federal revenue at the time was approximately $43 million. About 57% came from tariffs, around 30% came from excise taxes, the rest came from land sales and miscellaneous fees. Now pause for a moment and consider what was happening during that same era. Within a single decade, the federal government funded the completion of major rail networks, expanded the U.S. Navy significantly, constructed dozens of federal buildings, including courthouses and administrative centers, supported large-scale national and international events. And these weren't modest efforts. For example, a single naval battleship in the 1990s could cost around $3 million. Large federal buildings often required hundreds of thousands of dollars. National exhibitions received millions in funding. When you begin adding up these expenses across multiple years, the total becomes enormous, far larger than what the basic revenue model seems capable of sustaining comfortably. Now let's fast forward slightly. Between 1880 and 1910, federal revenue did increase, but only gradually. Around $268 million in expenditures in 1880, rising to nearly $694 million by 1910. That's a significant jump in spending. But revenue, especially from tariffs, did not increase at the same pace, which creates a widening gap. And that gap leads to an uncomfortable question. Was the official explanation telling the full story?
To understand the mystery, you have to visualize the scale of what was being built. Across the United States during the late 1800s and early 1900s, federal and state-backed construction projects were everywhere. Courthouses with imported marble, post offices in small towns designed with architectural grandeur, custom houses in port cities built to resemble ancient temples, government buildings featuring bronze, stone carvings, and intricate detailing. This wasn't minimalistic spending. This was confidence. This was abundance. Even smaller communities, places with populations of just a few thousand, were receiving federal buildings that would still be considered impressive today. So again, the same question returns. Where did all the money come from? Beyond the textbooks. Some historians argue that the answer lies in efficiency. They point to lower administrative costs, fewer federal programs, and a smaller scope of government responsibility. And while those factors certainly played a role, they don't fully explain the visible results. Because the evidence isn't just in numbers, it's in physical structures that still stand today. Structures that required skilled labor, imported materials, coordinated logistics, and significant financial backing. And yet, all of it existed in a system supposedly funded by tariffs and a handful of indirect taxes. A system few fully understand today. Part of the challenge in answering this question lies in how the system itself functioned. The federal government of that era did not operate in the same transparent, standardized way we expect today. Record-keeping existed, but it wasn't always centralized. Revenue categories were often broader, less detailed, and sometimes grouped under general labels that didn't clearly reveal their origin. Terms like miscellaneous receipts, special appropriations, or internal improvements appear in historical documents, but without the level of detail modern analysts might expect. And that ambiguity leaves room for interpretation. Then came a defining moment. In 1913, the United States ratified the 16th Amendment, granting Congress the authority to levy a federal income tax. Shortly after, the Revenue Act of 1913 introduced a structured income tax system, starting at 1% for lower qualifying incomes, rising to 7% for the highest earners. At the same time, another major development occurred, the establishment of a central banking system through the Federal Reserve Act. Two major financial transformations in the same year. Together, they reshaped how the government generated and managed money. A shift in philosophy. Before 1913, the government largely depended on external and indirect sources of income. After 1913, it gained the ability to draw revenue directly from individual earnings. That's a fundamental shift. It changed not only how the government was funded, but also how it interacted with citizens and the broader economy. And over time, income tax became one of the primary sources of federal revenue. But here's the lingering question. If the previous system was truly sufficient, if tariffs, excise taxes, and land sales were enough, then why was such a major change necessary? Was it simply about fairness and modernization? Or was it about replacing a system that had limitations or complexities that weren't widely understood? The beginning of a deeper investigation. To truly explore that question, we have to go beyond surface-level explanations. We have to examine lesser-known revenue sources, historical testimonies from those who worked within the system, government reports and investigations from that era, and specific case studies that challenge the official narrative. Because when you start connecting those pieces, a more complex picture begins to emerge. One that suggests the funding of the U.S. government before 1913 may not have been as simple or as transparent as we've been led to believe. As we move deeper into this topic, the story becomes less about what we know and more about what doesn't quite add up. Because once you begin comparing official revenue figures with actual government activity in the late 19th and early 20th centuries, a pattern starts to emerge. Not necessarily a conspiracy, but certainly a complexity that goes far beyond the simplified version most people are taught. The expanding gap between revenue and spending. Let's revisit the numbers, but this time with a sharper focus. By the early 1900s, federal expenditures had climbed to nearly $700 million annually.
Tariffs and excise taxes were still the primary sources of income, but revenue growth remained relatively modest compared to spending. This created a noticeable imbalance. Now, governments can and do operate with deficits. That's not unusual. But here's where things get interesting. Despite these financial pressures, the federal government continued to fund large-scale projects, events, and expansions without any clear indication of strain that would typically accompany such deficits. There were no widespread shutdowns, no halted construction across the board, no visible collapse in federal operations. Instead, the system kept moving, almost seamlessly, which leads to a critical question. Was there more money coming in than what was publicly emphasized? The role of non-tariff revenue. Historical records do in fact point to additional sources of income beyond tariffs and excise taxes. Some of these include fees from ports and harbors, leases on public lands, railroad usage agreements on federally granted land, resource extraction payments, including timber and minerals. These weren't minor streams. In a rapidly industrializing nation, access to land and resources held enormous value. Railroads, for example, were not just transportation systems, they were economic lifelines. Companies that operated across federally granted land often entered into agreements that included financial returns to the government. Similarly, industries extracting resources from public lands were typically required to pay fees or royalties. So yes, there were additional inflows of money beyond tariffs. But here's the key point. Even when you account for these sources, the numbers still don't always align neatly with the scale of federal spending. To understand why, we need to look at how financial records were categorized at the time. Unlike modern accounting systems, which aim for detailed transparency, earlier government ledgers often grouped revenues under broad headings. Terms like special appropriations, internal improvements, or miscellaneous receipts appear frequently in historical treasury reports. On the surface, these categories seem harmless, just administrative labels, but they often lack detailed breakdowns. In some cases, funds are recorded as received and spent without a clear explanation of their exact origin. That doesn't necessarily imply wrongdoing, but it does mean one thing: the full picture isn't always visible. Case study: the World's Fairs and National Expositions. One of the most fascinating examples of this financial complexity can be seen in large-scale national expositions of the time. Take the famous World's Fairs of the late 19th and early 20th centuries. These events were massive undertakings. They featured hundreds of buildings, advanced engineering and design, millions of visitors, and international participation. And while much of the funding came from private investors and host cities, the federal government often played a significant role. For instance, the government contributed millions of dollars to various expositions. It funded entire buildings designed to showcase national achievements. These structures were often elaborate, detailed, and constructed within tight timelines. Now here's the intriguing part. Some of these buildings were temporary. They were built, showcased for a few months, and then dismantled. Which raises an important question. Why allocate significant federal funds to projects with no long-term utility? From a modern perspective, it might seem inefficient, but at the time, these events were seen as opportunities to demonstrate national progress, technological advancement, and cultural influence on a global stage. Still, the funding behind them adds another layer to the larger puzzle. The complexity of infrastructure spending. It's also important to understand how infrastructure projects were financed during this era. Not all projects were funded in a straightforward one-time payment model. Some involved long-term contracts, public-private partnerships, land grants in exchange for development, or deferred payments or performance-based agreements. For example, railroad expansion often included agreements where companies received land or rights of way instead of direct cash payments. In return, the government benefited from increased economic activity, improved transportation networks, and access to new regions and resources. This kind of arrangement blurs the line between spending and investment. It also makes it more difficult to calculate the true financial flow within the system. Resource wealth, an underestimated factor. Another key element, often overlooked in simplified explanations, is the sheer scale of natural resources under federal control. During this period, the United States had vast reserves of timber, coal, iron, precious metals, and agricultural land. The management and monetization of these resources played a role in government funding. Through leases, sales, and usage fees, the government generated revenue from assets that, in many ways, functioned like a national portfolio. However, tracking these revenues isn't always straightforward. Records exist, but they're often scattered across departments and categorized inconsistently. And again, this leads to the same conclusion. There was more happening beneath the surface than a simple tariff-based system. The question of surpluses. Another detail that complicates the narrative is the presence of surpluses in certain periods. There are documented instances where federal accounts showed excess funds, even when tariff income alone wouldn't seem sufficient to produce them. Where did those surpluses come from? Possible explanations include efficient tax collection, economic expansion increasing overall trade, revenue from less visible sources, or conservative budgeting practices. Each of these factors likely played a role, but without fully detailed records, it's difficult to quantify their exact contributions. By the early 1900s, the United States was no longer a young nation finding its footing. It had become industrialized, economically complex, and increasingly involved in global affairs. And with that growth came new financial demands. The existing system, reliant on tariffs and excise taxes, may have been effective for a time, but it also had limitations. For one, tariff revenue depended heavily on international trade. Any disruption in imports could impact government income. Additionally, as the country expanded, so did the need for infrastructure, regulation, social programs, and military readiness, all of which required consistent and scalable funding. This brings us closer to understanding why a shift toward income tax might have been seen as necessary, not necessarily because the old system failed, but because it lacked flexibility, it was influenced by external economic factors, and it didn't scale easily with a growing population and economy. An income tax, on the other hand, offered a more direct and predictable revenue stream, the ability to adjust rates based on economic conditions, and a way to distribute financial responsibility across different income levels. From a policy standpoint, it made sense, but from a historical perspective, it also marked the end of an era. Even with all these explanations, one reality remains. There are still gaps, not necessarily in a dramatic or suspicious sense, but in a documentary sense. Some records from that era are incomplete, others were reorganized, reclassified, or lost over time. And as with any historical system, especially one operating over a century ago, not every detail survived. So where does that leave us? What we can say with confidence is this. Before 1913, the U.S. government relied on a combination of tariffs, excise taxes, resource-based revenue, land-related income, fees, and agreements tied to infrastructure and commerce. Together, these sources created a functioning financial system, one capable of supporting a growing nation. But it was also a system that operated differently from today's standards, that lacked the level of transparency we now expect, and that included revenue streams that are often underemphasized in modern explanations. The bigger picture. Rather than seeing this as a mystery with a single hidden answer, it may be more accurate to view it as a multi-layered system, one where revenue came from diverse and sometimes overlapping sources, accounting methods were less standardized, and economic growth played a major role in sustaining government activity. Still, the questions raised by the discrepancies between revenue, spending, and visible outcomes remain worth exploring because they challenge us to think more critically about how systems evolve and how history is often simplified over time. By the early 1900s, America wasn't small anymore. It was expanding fast. Industry, population, global power. But there was a problem. The old system couldn't keep up. In 1913, the 16th Amendment to the United States Constitution gave the government power to tax income directly. Then came the Federal Reserve Act, creating a central system to control money itself. Before this, the government mostly made money from tariffs and land. After this, it turned inward, taxing its own people continuously. Within decades, revenue exploded, government expanded, and the system we live under today was born. So those old buildings you see, they weren't built under the system you know. They came from a completely different America.